Is one China policy a good idea? At the end of World War II, China, known as Republic of China then, was much smaller in area than what we see today. Tibet was an independent nation, and so was Xinjiang, which was known as East Turkestan at that time. No part of Mongolia was part of China either. There was a little island on the west, named Taiwan, also called Formosa by many nations in the west, which was a Japanese colony. With the surrender of Japan, the Allied forces took Taiwan out of Japan's control, and it came under the control of the Republic of China, or ROC, for short. Republic of China was ruled by a party known as KMT, or Kuomintang, under their leader, Chiang Kai-Shek. In 1945, when the United Nations was formed, the Republic of China became part of the UN. However, the KMT-ruled China was engaged in a civil war for more than 2 decades, intermittently, with the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, under a powerful, and a ruthless leader, Mao Zedong. The major powers of the West, including the Soviet Union, tried to stop the civil war, playing the mediation role, which resulted in ceasefires. The ceasefires were not fully accepted by either party, and the hostile attitudes never vanished, and the civil war continued. Despite the overwhelming superiority of weaponry and the number of soldiers, the KMT army under Chiang Kai-Shek lost in a guerrilla warfare, to the communist forces under Mao. On October 1, 1949, the Communists took over the entire mainland of China. It was named as the People's Republic of China, or PRC. Chiang Kai-Shek made a hurried exit, crossing the Taiwan Strait, and reached the safe shores of the island of Taiwan. The idea was, the ROC under Chiang Kai-Shek will come back in full force, and defeat the opportunistic communist forces, at the appropriate time. For a long time, Chiang Kai-Shek kept repeating this promise in many forums. However, this dream never materialized, at least until now. When the Communists took over China in 1949, the KMT armed forces, political leaders or other supporters, who were left behind in mainland China, were executed mercilessly, or tortured and imprisoned in subhuman conditions. There were many KMT forces and supporters, who joined the communist side, and relinquished any ties to the KMT. The communists went on a door-to-door campaign, hunting for KMT sympathizers, where neighbors turned against each other, to win the appreciation and favor from the newly formed communist government, under Mao. As a military campaign, the Chinese communists wanted to cross the Taiwan Strait, and defeat the KMT leader, Chiang Kai-Shek, in Taiwan. However, Chiang Kai-Shek and the KMT had established good relations with many countries, including with the United States. The US, and the UN, were ready to engage in a war, to stop the communist takeover, of the island of Taiwan. The ideology war between liberal democracy on one side, and communism on the other, had just begun, and prevention of the spread of communism was critical for the democratic nations. When Mao realized he cannot take over Taiwan by force, he decided to wait for the right opportunity to strike. That wait is still on. Now, with all this background, let's understand what is One China policy. Though the Republic of China under KMT were officially defeated, they claimed they were the real China, and staked their claim on the mainland. So, the world was divided who was the legitimate ruler of China. Most of the countries under the Soviet influence recognized the communist-controlled People's Republic of China, PRC, immediately after its formation. India, which was not part of the Soviet bloc, was a surprising entry, which supported the PRC, and didn't recognize ROC as the real China. By the early 1950s, countries around the world had taken a position on which China they recognized as real. Is it the KMT-ruled Republic of China, under their leader Chiang Kai-Shek, operating from Taiwan? Or is it the Communist China under the CCP, with its leader Mao, ruling from mainland China? The West chose Taiwan-based ROC as the real China, and so the ROC represented China, in all major international forums, including the UN. The Soviet bloc and India were supporting the PRC, and advocated that it should be seen as the real China. Either way, nobody spoke of two separate China. There was always only one China. It differed between different nations, who represented that one China. The US-led initiative in 1971 changed all of this upside down. In a short few years, Communist China, or the PRC, became the real China, in most international forums, and Taiwan was uprooted of any international legitimacy. In July 1971, Henry Kissinger, the National Security Advisor, under the US President Nixon, made a secret visit to Beijing, trying to promote the US-China relationship. Kissinger was a big fan of China, which continues till date. He had heavily influenced the Nixon administration, with his strong bias towards communist China. The irony was, the PRC under Mao was ideologically rigid in its communism, much worse than the Soviets, and was one of the most brutal regimes in human history, in suppressing its own citizens, who espoused any ideas of freedom. The US itself was going around the world fighting against communism, and sacrificing the lives of its citizens to protect the same freedom, which China was accused of suppressing with an iron fist. Kissinger's initiative and his conviction has received a lot of criticism in recent years, but back then, he was hailed as a master statesman, with absolute brilliance. The PRC started putting conditions on the international community, that anybody who had diplomatic ties with PRC, will have to relinquish their ties with Taiwan. In other words, there was only one China, and that was the People's Republic of China, under Mao, in Beijing. This policy became loosely known as One China policy. Many countries which established diplomatic relations with the PRC, accepted the One China policy. The US also accepted the One China policy, but left the wordings not well defined, which became known as the policy of strategic ambiguity. Once China got the world powers to accept the One China policy, China decided to push the point hard, and showed high degree of sensitivity, towards even a slight perception of deviation, from this policy. Countries around the world started bending over backwards, to please China, and started making it difficult for Taiwan to exist as an independent entity. While China was following a rigid communist style of governance since 1949, Taiwan became a multi-party democratic nation, starting from the 1980s, with free and fair elections. Taiwan, which is made up of a main island, and a bunch of surrounding smaller islands, made enormous progress, both in its economy and technology, since the 1960s. Despite the similarities between Taiwan and China, the differences that exist today are too wide, to have a peaceful assimilation, of Taiwan into China. China has repeatedly told that it will annex Taiwan, either by peace, or by force. Realizing that Taiwan's multi-party democracy, basic human rights, religious freedom, and other liberties, can be a threat to the Chinese Communist Party, China has said repeatedly, that the Taiwanese people need to undergo a re-education program, to accept communism, and its rigidity into their life. This has created a widespread anxiety in the minds of average Taiwanese, who have seen the concentration camps in Xinjiang, called as re-education camps by the communist rulers in Beijing. It doesn't come as a surprise, that the Taiwanese are never willingly going to accept the rule of communist China, because they see what happened to the residents of Hong Kong, or Xinjiang. Historically, Taiwan was part of China during the Qing dynastic rule, but was not part of mainland China, since 1895, except for the 4 years, between 1945 to 1949. With all the background, we'll ask the simple question. Is it a good idea, for the world to continue with the One China policy? Or is it time to seek an alternative to it? This brings up another question. Is there really an alternative? The alternative is recognizing Taiwan, as an independent nation, and including it in the League of Nations. In other words, PRC will remain as China, and Taiwan will be a new addition, as a separate country. Obviously, the risk will be to deal with China's wrath. If the world does not ponder over the alternative solutions, and start a consultative discussion, it doesn't mean everything will be fine, and the world can stay in peace. China doesn't like the status quo, and want to annex Taiwan by force, if they fail to do so through peaceful means. They have repeatedly given the impression that the invasion of Taiwan is imminent. When such threats are given by China, there are many in the Western world, including the US, Australia, Japan, South Korea, the UK, Germany, France, Austria, New Zealand, Denmark, and many other nations, who openly suggest that they need to get militarily involved to defend Taiwan. In fact, they strongly state that a military victory for China in Taiwan will be an existential threat for many other nations. This belief has led them to conclude that there is no option but to directly engage with China, despite any cost involved in that strategy. This runs a much bigger risk to the world, and a discussion on Taiwan becomes a much safer option. Irrespective of whether a discussion on the merits and demerits of the One China policy will bring about a solution or not, it's worth taking the effort to bring it to an international platform, and see if any reasonable solution can be arrived at, before it becomes the cause for a full-scale global war. Thanks for watching.